Let's talk about maintaining and keeping strong a classic D&D campaign. At this part of the series, we defined the term classic D&D, drawing on some language by other writers and theorists. The idea is classic D&D is D&D similar to how it was played by some key creators in the 70s, particularly Gary Gygax, most particularly. And we talked about these three pillars, and I'll come back to these, but the idea that it's world first, player driven, challenge oriented. These three pillars that make it different to other ways that people play D&D. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to assume this. I've talked about starting a classic D&D campaign, and I thought sometime talking about how you keep it going once it's going, talking about kind of like, so I've got it going. Now, how do I keep it interesting? How do I not just have kind of hopefully fun times with my friends, but help create something memorable, build something with them that's really memorable? And that doesn't happen by kind of pre-plot in the classic form. It doesn't happen by pre-plotting everything. It happens via the kind of results of these other pillars. And so I'm assuming you've got players. They're not all sociopaths. You know, you're not dealing with loads of problems socially, and that's why things are going wrong. Sometimes campaigns fall apart just because people move. There's four of you. One of the guys moves. Things are a bit harder with the other two. You know, that guy was a really active guy, or whatever. Sometimes it's personnel management. People are difficult, clash with each other, something like that. Social skills are important for DMs, but they're not. That's not actually what makes a game classic D&D. So thankfully, I don't have to counsel you on how to talk to other human beings. I just want to talk about classic D&D techniques I use. It's not exhaustive. There is other counsel out there available. So just what I'll do, basically here's the thing, is that rather than top down or bottom up, you've got to think in terms of what you need to do for this classic D&D campaign. You're not attempting to kind of come up with one system that does everything, but you're looking for techniques that emphasize the pillars. So it's in terms of heuristics, is value driven rather than so, you know, as in it's about what these key values are rather than attempting to force a particular system to work. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, let's talk about this. World first, player driven, challenge oriented. So the world has its own life. It has its own internal logic. It has stuff to do that isn't just about the players' backstories. That's obviously, some games will really emphasize that. We're not talking about that. In fact, that probably isn't very important in most classic games. It might have some importance, but not very much. So the world has its own life. That's what, and its logic. That's world first. Player driven. It basically means players get to make decisions within the campaign world about what they care about. Their decisions change things and matter. And I mean, I'm sure in every good game, player choice matters in some ways. But here what we're talking about is the idea that the DM has not said, here is the road before you. This is everything that matters and that you have to care about. And your decisions are just what cool stuff you do about it. It's rather that you're like, look, we use the word sandbox sometimes for this. Sandbox is about the idea that you're making decisions about the whole world and you're affecting it and you're building the world. You're making your own sandcastles. And it's challenging, it's challenge oriented. That's the third pillar. It's a game. There's some degree of success to be achieved by defeating enemies, finding treasure, building castles, whatever it is. In that sense, there is a limited sense in which D&D can be won. It can't be won in a simple binary usually, but usually survival, advancement, success at getting stuff and doing stuff, that is winning. Losing is humiliating failure. You know, we're not talking about trying to tell a story where your character falls into darkness and that's really cool and they fail. Challenge oriented means that you're attempting to solve puzzles, beat enemies, build alliances, whatever. So how do you keep it going? I've got 4 ongoing campaigns. This is my background at the moment that are well established, lots of different things going on. They've been running for 6, 4, 3 and 2 years respectively. And I'm going to offer a few pieces of advice from my experience. Of course, it's not exhaustive, as I've already said. So we'll have some theory and we'll have some anecdotes, basically. 2 opening caveats. I've already said about personnel issues. and there, you can mitigate those. But if the comet is headed for your planet, it doesn't matter how good your yes, I'm going to sort this out kind of systems are. And so yeah, we won't be dealing with that. And sometimes I guess the only advice I've got to give you is you can't maintain your campaign. If you can, please do. Two, if you're running other sorts of D&D campaigns, the solutions are different. You're not hopefully you'll find this interesting, but you're not going to be like, oh wow, I found all these techniques helpful. Maybe some of them are, but usually with other styles of D&D, the solutions are different and I think easier. Usually a very traditional linear campaign follows a particular big story. It's fairly easy to prepare for. You know what you're going to be running or likely to be running. The real challenge is making this all compelling to players. Players might be like, this is boring, don't feel like this is very interesting, I don't want to do this. So you just load in the next levels to the game cartridge, and your job is then to sell the players on it. I'm not talking about that. Or 2.5, a mega dungeon is often a classic D&D campaign, but I do think much of what I'm going to say is going to be more limited in use to someone who's doing a pure mega dungeon campaign. Some of it will be useful, but the mega dungeon campaign has a more narrow form of progression that usually needs less work from the DM because the group hears about stuff in the dungeon, they find new staircases in the dungeon, so the natural development is all within a fairly contained area. And it may or may not be compelling. Again, the DM has to sell at some level, the dungeon has to sell itself and the DM has to sell the dungeon. But you're not talking about kind of, what happens when players get to a loose end? What happens when we finish something? Because the whole thing is the mega dungeon. So at the start of this sort of classic campaign, things are easier because the scope of action is limited, right? You have the players, they either are told, here's the dungeon, or you give them a few options for what they can do. There are a few local dungeons. The dungeons are offering the challenge. The whole logic of the world is in that, right? In that. So the logic of the world doesn't mean you write everything out. It just means that the world makes sense to the players, is legible, is a good word, is legible to the players, comprehensible to the players. And if you can keep that up indefinitely, more power to your arm. If it's only ever a kind of tiny amount of stuff around them and that works, then great. I found that players pick up interest in all sorts of things. They poke at all sorts of things as they inhabit a world for a longer time. This is actually good. It's actually fun. But having some preparation for it or understanding how to handle when they start asking about stuff like, is there someone who can do this? Or I heard this legend, in this dungeon there's this legend, what's that about? It helps a lot if you know a bit more about that, if you have a bit more of an idea about what's going on elsewhere, so you don't get caught short. And I would say I use 3 main techniques to make this work for me. I don't use every technique I've heard other people use. I don't use them at least all equally, but there are other views available. But here are 3 techniques, and they are, just to give them the titles, we call them rumour banks, semi-dynamic worlds, and stable play. Rumour banks. So I pretty invariably start off campaigns with a few rumours, things that, there's a monster here, or there's a bounty out for this. Either they're randomised off a table, or they're on a list given to the players. So for instance, in my 6-year-long campaign, in the very first session in a game store with like 9 players, they rolled a couple of rumours off a job list. That was in the supplement I was using. I hadn't written it. And they decided to follow one. They started to go down the river towards where they'd heard the rumour was. And that session was about a random encounter of a random location encounter on the way. So this does feed in, by the way, to the fact that obviously encounter tables help keep things fresh and force improvisation. Like what happens when your players generate a Gyna Sphinx in a swamp, as happened in my Open Tables game, as some viewers will remember. So that game, it's 3 years old now. It has, in terms of through real life years, and it's getting to the end of its first year in game. And it has a seasonal list of rumours for each season, and it has official jobs that are seasonal. And some of these will change or be removed or alter as things go on. And we'll probably get back to that. I think I'll talk about that a bit more. But the very first job was assigned to the PCs by their NPC boss in the first session. So they have this kind of job table, rumour table, which is open. There's no other rumours for that region. If they go to different places, they can pick up new rumours. But they've got that job list, and they've got a room list, sorry, and a job list. And the point is, what you're doing here with how you start the campaign is, whether from the start or after the first dungeon or whatever, it gives the players an initial sense of the scope of the world, of the fact that their agency is significant, that what they choose that sounds more fun or more lucrative or whatever, that the world is theirs to play with. And this drives all three pillars of our classic play theory. It's world first because it emphasizes the world above and beyond the players, the sorts of things that are going on in the world. It's not the players are sort of, it's not that there are just missions that happen and players have to do them. It's that there's this whole world going on outside, and it tells the players the sorts of things that are going on outside. It's player driven because the players actually get to choose what to do, and this Mandelbrot's out to every stage of play basically. Players determine importance of objectives, and I think a criticism can be, well, is there just stuff that the DM's going to want to run and other stuff isn't there? And hey, there's a self-discipline thing there. You have to put stuff on the list that you're willing to run. And you have to, at that point, self-limit and respect none of the players for choosing that, because there's a thing there that you're going to enjoy it more long term if you self-negate a bit on some of those things and let players drive things. I think, in my experience, you could say player decision. Look, it doesn't matter, right? Because they can just do A or B, and then they can A and then B, and we'll talk a bit more about this as we go on. But of course that can be the case. In some ways, who cares? The point is the players have chosen what they think they can do now, or they want to do now, and then they do the other thing later. It means the choice is about setting difficulties and conditions rather than about kind of real opportunity costs. But you can insert opportunity costs, as I sometimes do. And it's challenge oriented because players need to decide if they can succeed at a job or if they have to wait. They need to sometimes deduce whether a rumour is reliable or partially false. I basically don't really put false rumours on tables, just as an aside. But the point is, even this point of deciding what jobs to do is challenge oriented, even if it's only at a logistical level rather than a operational or tactical level. And you can find more advice about rumour tables or whatever elsewhere. But I think the principle is that nearly everything the players get their hands on is actionable. It's something that matters. It needs to usually lead to gameplay, or not be so vague or so irrelevant that nothing can happen with it. Occasionally, if you've got a big table of like 10 pieces of information the players have, one thing that's more, there is a war in the east, and you're thinking as the world develops, this war is going to potentially spread west to where the players are based. That could be a relevant thing to put on the list, but you don't want that as you get 2 rumours at the start of the campaign, and one of them is that, because they're not going to do anything with it. Second technique, semi-dynamic worlds, we call it. Semi-dynamic, by the way, for those wondering, because of course I don't have the computations that a computer does, and I don't want them. And I don't think it's what's necessary strictly, but the point is you can't make everything fully, you can't run a Radiant AI. You can't fully instance the world at all points in your head simultaneously. You can potentially sort of have that always there in the background, so players can come and say, what about this? And you can think about it and know. But yes, semi-dynamic. Things are to some degree happening, basically, and to some degree responsive, which is what we're going to talk about. The second tool is the idea that the world reacts and changes. Here is a Lord of the Rings example of dynamism. Think about how Saruman is beaten in Rohan, and this leads to a couple of things. It leads to the fact that Rohan can go to Gondor's aid, and indeed related to that Aragorn can walk the paths of the dead. So those 2 big things, and that eventually leads to them going to the Black Gate, which helps clear out Mordor. So Saruman being defeated has a whole set of downstream effects there to do with what the player characters are doing. But Saruman also is doing something because he's only imprisoned, he escapes, he goes and starts mucking up the Shire. There are positive and negative consequences and developments in the campaign which give continued value and importance to decisions made in the past. And this presses again on all 3 pillars. It's world first. This is obvious. The internal logic of the world, the way in which the world is separate from the players and their characters, therefore the way the world is legible, comprehensible to players, obviously benefits from a world which corrects for the actions of the players, or if nothing anyone ever does, because basically, if nothing anyone does matters. If everything's static, the world is dull at the very least, and if the world reacts in bizarre or puzzling ways, because you just dump extra random stuff in, if you're throwing it in, nothing develops organically, the world is illegible. Players can't make decisions. Like, imagine if in your life, either at a kind of fairly trivial level in a sense, just laws kept randomly changing, you're constantly being arrested for all kinds of random stuff, or you were suddenly allowed to do stuff you weren't allowed to previously, or at a kind of more fantastical level, if the laws of nature changed in just random and unpredictable ways, you would be much less able to make decisions, normal decisions. And it's the same in a sub-creative way in the game, that you have to be able to say, I see why this has happened, or I can work this out why this has happened. And you want it to be interesting, so you don't want it to be static, like nothing changes, you just go to the different dungeons, clear them out at the right level. You want there to be some sense that there's, and this is where the opportunity cost dimension comes in, is less in the rumour banks itself, and it's more in the way the world reacts to the players doing stuff. Either way, the campaign is damaged if you don't have some degree of dynamism. It's the same principle with having a dungeon that players can understand, but applied to the whole campaign. It's also player driven. I've touched on it already actually, but player decisions matter. Who they save, who they kill, what they finish off. It feeds back later into the campaign, and this operates at all kinds of levels, from the result of one adventure giving the party some sort of set boon, they get this magic item, or a bane, they get an enemy, to big political events happening and changing the world because of their actions. And it's challenge oriented in a sense. This is actually more the DM's purview to some degree. You're the one making the world react, so in a sense you could say, well, the challenge is on the DM. There's little immediate challenge orientation with this technique. That's not the purpose. It's about creating future compelling content in the world. But you do teach consequences this way, which loops back into treating the game as a game and dealing with its challenges intelligently. If you know that you play badly and stuff goes badly, and you play well and stuff goes well because the consequences are good and bad, not just in the immediate sense, but afterwards as well, then you're going to feel happy about it. You're going to be like, yeah, let's do, I'll do more of that, or we need to be better at this. And I think it's on the channel actually, when we streamed Dark Sun, and the players nearly got, most of them got killed, most of the PCs got killed by a boulette, and then they debriefed afterwards, and a bit of it was on the stream, so you can go back and find that. And they just discussed, like, what do we do? How do we played badly, how do we do better next time? And they've done better since. They're much better at that kind of stuff. They're still chaotic, but they're much better. So that was a very short-term consequence, but that's part of how this deals with that. I'm going to give a few anecdotes now just to talk about consequences because I think it's very hard. You can form an equation. Someone cleverer than me probably could just create an axiom here, like when this happens, do this, in a generic sense. X then Y. But I will give anecdotes, and maybe you can draw something from it. One, timers on rumours and locations and events. In the open table game, there are a few timers that have now passed, so there's no spoiler there. One was, there were raiders bothering a more remote, freehold, and they had asked for help from the Baron, and so eventually the players went. Now, that had a month's timer on it, and if the players hadn't gone, the place would have been destroyed by the orcs. In another case, there was a location where the players had heard there was some silver had washed out of a cave, and they're like, oh great, that's interesting. But they didn't go, and the timer on it that expired was that orcs would move there, and they would form a camp in the front caves, which obviously meant the players then had to deal with that. And that wasn't actually too severe for them, to be fair. That wasn't a super severe consequence, because the 6 or 7 orcs or whatever who were camping there, they killed with the loss of a few spells and a few hit points. So it wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened. It could have been worse if they'd played differently at the time. And I've had other consequences on tables or kind of around the world like that. They are direct things which you can actually just write when you write the table. You just say, there is this event going to happen on this date. Time records do matter. I'll touch on this in the final technique, stable play, but time records matter for this. Again, big political event in the same campaign, Ilafan. The players have they've smashed, though not completely destroyed, the orcs and goblins living in Ilafan. They've dealt a defeat to the undead, the necromancer, not the undead, because he's got bandits too, but the necromancer's forces. They've skirmished with the Duergar who have moved in. That, by the way, that's an organic thing that happened due to their consequences. Let's talk about that first. They were dealing with some caves with some Zvarts. They followed the caves down to pursue, because they raided a few times, and then the bad guys had left. There are a few civilian Zvarts hiding around, but the bad guy had left, and who led them, and they followed him down into the Underdark. They were too low level. They got colour sprayed by that guy actually, and taken prisoner by Duergars, and they negotiated their release with the lawful Duergar by trading a map to Ilafan with them, because the Duergar, like, we don't really care about these guys if we can get something. So the Duergar have now found their way to Ilafan, and so they're there too. That's something that matters. But something that has happened, they've done this stuff. They've smashed the orcs and goblins. They've defeated some of the necromancer's troops, and they've skirmished with the Duergar, and they found all the royal stuff, the royal panoply and the treasure rooms and stuff of the ancient dwarf kingdom, and gave it to the dwarf lord, who had a kind of small area under control. They've expanded his control. They've given him the royal panoply. He is now he's going to be crowned the king of Ilafan. A major political event that's going to affect other stuff, that affects other powers in that whole region of the world, which itself, because it's shared with other games, that affects those games too as they travel through that area. Chatters. This happened in Spelljammer. You can go and watch this. There was rumours on a dwarf anvil ship that there was some kind of creatures stealing tools and causing chaos, and so the PCs went to find them and eventually found them, and chose not to kill these weird little kind of semi-intelligent gibbon people. And then, because they didn't, they were rewarded, which was good, because these creatures are seen as lucky. If they'd killed a bunch of chatters, there probably would have been some trouble. I think they would have been given the gold by the dwarves, being lawful good, and sent away and told never to come back. But they got them. They got the gold, and 2 chatters left the colony to come with them to go and inhabit somewhere else, to kind of colonize somewhere else. But that's cute anyway. It's nice. It's now, you got some little gibbon people, and they help guard the ship when the PCs are busy, along with the NPC pilot. But they also, when these harpies attacked, the chatters saved versus the harpy song as the ship came in, as their spelljammer came in, and were part of the counterattack that drove the harpies off and meant the party was not TPK'd. I think they had some injuries, but it wasn't that bad, basically, in the end, partly because of the chatters. That was a decision they made that reaped dividends. Meechan Givens, or the so-called the imposter Meechan Givens in Open Table Realms, who was a guard, who said, I'm a guard from the same place you're from Daggerford, I will help you on this mission, and went with them, and then came back, and then at a particular point they woke up. I gave them a chance to wake up. They woke up, saw her breaking into the altar they'd found and stealing something from inside it, and then disappearing. And they're like, so she's betrayed us. This has led to other hijinks since, but that was the whole thing where they trusted someone, they got betrayed. And that is something which, because it's tied into a wider plot by Dark Forces and the Red Wizards of Thay, it matters. They're like, we had the item that we could have taken back. We didn't have to trust this random person that we didn't really know much about. We never checked with the actual authorities. We met her elsewhere. We trust her so completely. So there's something there where that is a tangible set of decisions that, even if they weren't being completely stupid in all this, but it means that they have suffered a consequence, that they don't have that peace when they could have had that peace. Greyhawk. One reason my players are currently finishing off the Moat House with a second and third level party, mostly plus Elmo, is because they've done a few quests where bad guys have gotten away, and one of my players was like, I'm looking at this, we have to go and finish the Moat House, because in several cases we've literally, it says here, then this person got away. Our enemies are going to come back and get us. We have to start finishing our enemies off. And so that's just something where it's changed player behaviour. It's informed play that they can't just rack up enemies who are waiting out there to come and get them. One final example, in my 6-year-old game, which is also in the Forgotten Realms and has parties in the northwest, actually near Open Table Realms, who very slightly touch each other's paths, actually. But what happened was they'd got a job early on, relatively early on. I say that, it was like 2 years in. They were told, okay, this dinosaur, semi-intelligent dinosaur, will help you do something. He'll fly around and stuff if you help his people. later. And so they're like, the Lizardman Druid was like, yes, of course, we'll do that. And then they went and fought some corrupted lizardmen and helped the good lizardmen in this big jungle. And then a bit later, once they'd trained up and stuff, they were like, let's go back and deal with the blue dragon who's bothering them. But the blue dragon, in the meantime, had not grown in age category, actually, but because of the time that passed, the remaining corrupted lizardmen, or a warband of them, had come and joined the blue dragon. So there was just a different dungeon there. Not all of this is stuff that's open to the players, in terms of, I don't say, by the way, all this changed, but some of it's obvious, because they're like, these are the Akabkan. They're some of the same guys. They've obviously come away from this. That's what the players were saying. It was legible to them. They could understand because other things had happened in the campaign and they could piece 2 and 2 together. And they could see that the situation had changed. In the same way, actually, there's a red dragon in the same subcontinent, who has taken over a larger area. They heard a rumour about her at the start, or they met her fairly on, actually. And now she's sent her forces out and she's expanded her grip. So there's going to be more conflict. Finally, the final technique I want to talk about is stable play. This is going to connect into time records, but it's about stables of characters. Finally, basically, our university runs some sort of stable play in my campaigns. All of those campaigns I've mentioned, where players run a stable of PCs. Usually they start with 1 and add as necessary. You know, if they're not super active in the campaign, they only have 1 PC, that's fine, but they can have several. And sometimes they make more than 1 at first, like in Dark Sun, literally, which is on hold as we're playing Spelljammer. You make a trio of 4 players, because we're using the official technique of character trees. This was very much standard in the early days in lots of games, especially in Gary's Greyhawk game, but we hear about it elsewhere in the 70s and 80s. It's I think in the Greenwood Undermountain game and a few other examples you hear about, there's people who play a few different characters. And you hear about it now in terms of people like some of Gabalux's games, Tony Huso, his campaigns. You see people like, oh yeah, there's a couple of characters. When I'm thinking with Tony, by the way, where he puts his spreadsheets up and like, these players have these characters. People are using it for different reasons, so I'm not kind of universalizing what I'm doing to everyone who's ever done it. But you know, there are, as I say, there are multiple reasons why this might happen. Partly, I think, in the early day, because pace of play demanded. I mean, they were playing several times a week, right? Often for like 6 hours, and it meant players needed different PCs for different adventures, or they'd have to sit out a lot of sessions. And my character is doing that, so essentially, because everyone had the interest, and we'll touch on why it mattered, but had the interest, they needed the extra characters. Gary had a self-coherent world, and PCs had to be in one place. This is where it starts. And very few of us have that pace of play now. Some people do play, so I play a couple of times a week usually. Other people do play even more. But very few of us have that pace of play for a campaign now. But there is a lesson in there that a real, inverted commas, fictional world with lots of stuff going on, full of adventure, is going to include principles like PCs being in one place and not transposed to another simultaneously. There are going to be lots of threads players like, or they pick up, or which affect their interests. And though real life time can be a pressure, you can't afford to do all the stuff because you don't have the time in real life. An option to allow them to explore more of the world and see how the different threads interact is to open them up to running a stable of PCs. It might be that 1 week you run one adventure, the next week you run another. It might be that you run the same adventure solid until it's finished and it's time to move on. I do both. The key thing is the players have their player, not PC, fingers in many pies. They have to deal with the logistics of the world, the choices of where to send what PC, etc. And I've seen this interact with the other techniques discussed here, especially on picking a party to handle a problem. I should say that, just to step back, what's going on here, the reason why the self-coherence matters, they have to be in one place, not another. Well, you could say, well, why not let everything run on end to end? But then that means you weaken a dynamic world. Everything is just waiting for the player's one perfect PC to turn up. And you want stuff to constantly be happening and changing, and the players react to that and feel compelled by that. They're like, I have to go and do this. We have to go and rescue these people. That kind of thing. And you as a DM have to levy consequences when they don't. According to the techniques I'm using. And there are other things that are going to factor in other than travel time and the fact of the lack of what is the word? Basically omnipresence, but there's another word I'm thinking of. But yes, there's also the fact that if you're imposing training times, if you're imposing um, injury recovery times, again, injury recovery time is a consequence for partial failure, and training time there's a bunch of reasons for this and not everyone is into this, but I'm just saying if you're imposing those as well, anything that takes up time, you have to research a spell, you have to go and talk to a sage, you have to do this, you have to do that. All these things take up time, as well as the adventures. And if you are attempting to create a self-coherent world and a dynamic world, then stable play is a partial answer. You don't need to have the 70s pace of play to find a purpose for stable play because of that. As I say, I've seen it interact with other techniques, I've mentioned some, but one is picking a party to handle a problem, and I see players sorting their characters according to what sort of bigger objectives they might have as well. In one campaign, for instance, in the 6-year-old one, each player has 4 characters basically. Sometimes they actually have more just floating around because they need a random low-level guy to do something. The party as a whole has had 3 of the 4 sub-parties overwinter in Waterdeep, in the Forgotten Realms this is, at the same time, so they can swap PCs between parties for appropriate jobs. And one is heading overland to the microclimate high forest through the snow to seek out a powerful patron for the magic user. Another is waiting for the sea to free up so they can go north to find a famous smith to make suits of magic armor, because they want magic armor that is particularly suited to them, magic weapons or whatever it is they want. And another is going to head south back to the tropics to run down a rumour of a pirate queen, and then they're going to head to Sigil, which they've been to once, to set up a permanent base there because they want to do more planar exploration, because there's some high level characters here as well as some mid and low. So they've wanted to swap the characters around to get the people who are going to be best at the particular jobs and who are interested. By that I mean, like, as in, you're like, I would like this character because they're good at this kind of stuff or whatever. These have been selected on the basis of what PCs are good at and if there's any special interest. And I think as a subsidiary point to this, a world first benefit, a major world first benefit here, is the fact that as time records become important, players' understanding of the logic of the world becomes more significant. They have to overwinter, for instance. They know distances between places. They look for shortcuts between places. They want fast transportation. They want to know high-level wizards with teleport circles. It's player driven because the idea of the player as agent rather than the PC as agent becomes central. It emphasizes player agency beyond the official storyline because it also means you take risks with characters. This connects to challenge orientation actually, but you take risks with characters to some degree because the player is the one playing the game rather than the PC. Whereas if you have obviously many good campaigns you just run one PC, but if you have one PC there may be a temptation to think, I need this PC to survive and succeed, and my entire interest in the world is about this avatar. Whereas though you should value any successful avatar, if the avatar is somewhat fungible, you are more likely to say, okay, I'll take risks. Because you're aware the world is out there and dynamic, and maybe you can go and get raised dead. And I think just as an aside to that, I think of the instance of my players asking in the realms, like, oh, can we go to Candlekeep? And I was like, yeah, you can go to Candlekeep. You've got to make effort, you've got to go and get a ship. And they felt confident saying that because they knew that the world was going to respond to them and it was open to them. But the point with stable play is that it also interacts with those things because it emphasizes the player deciding stuff, and it emphasizes the rules of the world in a way that the players understand and start to influence their decisions. Anyway, that is what I got to say today, and I hope the mixture of theory, anecdote and ramble has been helpful. As I say, 3 main techniques: rumour banks, stable play, semi-dynamic worlds. Tell me what you use to kind of keep up the interest, make these games run long, keep the cool stories developing, because obviously the cool stories are not what you write beforehand, but what happens at the table. Tell me what you do in the comments, and I'll see you next time.